one of the best things about Let's Talk Nights is we get a chance to break things down into smaller, bite-sized chunks. And a lot of us feel like we can be overwhelmed by messages or overwhelmed by teaching because there's so much. And so we've tried to keep these a little smaller and more concise, add some other things and just to help us. But we're still talking about praying through the storm. And we're going to continue that and work on that because praying through the storm is so important. And today we're going to cover a number of things, and we'll see how far we get. But we're going to talk about praying to powerless gods, praying to the God of Jonah, praying to stop the storm, and believing in the impossible. Let's go ahead and get started. So praying to powerless gods. Are you open to believing in God? So maybe you are visiting the Let's Talk Night and you're thinking about, maybe I'm curious about God, I'm curious about the Bible, I'm curious about spiritual things. I don't exactly know how to have that conversation. In Jonah 1:4, which we've covered before, but the Lord hurled a powerful wind over the sea, causing a violent storm that threatened to break the ship apart. Fearing for their lives, the desperate sailors shouted to their gods for help and threw the cargo overboard to lighten the ship. But all this time, Jonah was sound asleep down in the hold. So the captain went after him. "How can you sleep at a time like this?" he shouted. "Get up and pray to your God. Maybe he will pay attention to us and spare our lives." See, one of the things that happens here is Jonah doesn't pay attention because Jonah's wrapped up in his own drama, but the sailors are actually open to believing in God. And that's important to know. The sailors are open to believing in God. One of the reasons we have Let's Talk Nights is because sometimes we spend too much time talking to ourselves, meaning as Christians, we can just talk to ourselves. We can reinforce each other, but we don't necessarily know how always to include others. Jonah had that thing because Jonah was used to being a prophet who spoke to Israel. We've talked about that before. And so now he was being asked to go to Nineveh and speak to people who were not Israelites, who were not Jewish. And when he was given that job, it overwhelmed him. It made him fearful. It made him disagree with God. And so one of the things that happens is he gets a front row seat to people who actually are open to believing in God. And at first, he's not paying attention to them. He's feeling good about himself. He's feeling safe. He's running away from God. God, he doesn't think he's going to do anything dramatic. And so he's asleep when the storm comes. And the desperate sailors, though, they're shouting. They're shouting to their gods. But guess what? Basically, we can tell their gods weren't really doing a lot because they went to Jonah and said, "You need to get up and pray to your God." And so one of the things we need to think about is, who do we know in our lives who's open to believing in God, but we're ignoring? Who do we know in our lives that's feeling some level of desperation in their life and would love to have a spiritual friend who they could talk to and get counsel from? I've had a lot of people come to me and talk to me just because they've gotten to know me and ask me questions. And I have people I know and I ask them questions. And you seek support from them. I think so often it's easy to ignore in all that's going on that there are people that are open to believing in God. Well, when we're praying through the storm, we have to understand there are people praying to powerless gods. And when they pray to powerless gods, they can't get through the storm. This is why people are being devastated even after the pandemic, financially, emotionally. That's why divorce has increased. That's why drug addiction and use has increased. Because people don't have a God that is the God. They have a God that is maybe money, maybe possessions, a God that's drugs. They don't have God of the Bible. And I think when we start believing our own selves in the God of the Bible and then showing other people this is how mighty he is. And look, these guys are desperate. They are desperate, so they're open. I think one of the most important things to understand tonight in our Let's Talk Nights is, are we willing to turn our attention away from ourselves and see how many people are suffering in their lives because they don't know what you and I know? That there's a God who we can pray to who can still the storm. Now Jonah, in chapter 1 and verse 7 through 8, we learn that he was somebody who, in the middle of all this, was sleeping and not really paying attention and kind of going on his own way. And then guess what? While he was doing that, the sailors, they wanted to make sure they hadn't offended the gods. And they said, "Jonah, we hope you haven't offended anybody. Have you offended the gods? Whose God? Who did it?" And so they cast a lot. That's kind of the rolling dice. They rolled dice, said, who is the guy who's offended the gods? And guess what? Jonah was chosen. The sailors asked him, "Who are you and who is your God?" They actually were like, "Okay, what's going on? You obviously got a problem with your God. Our gods don't seem to be doing anything right now. But your God's doing something, and you seem to have a problem, but you're not working this stuff out. What happened with you and your God?" They were very open. They were like, "Tell us about yourself. Tell us about God. Tell us what's going on." Then in chapter 1, verse 9, Jonah answers, "I'm a Hebrew. I worship the God who made the sea and the land." And you know what? When he said, "I worship the God of the sea and the land," they figured it out. Wait, sea? We got a storm? Land? That's where we want to be? Hey, that's the God we need. Tell us more about this God. See, even when Jonah was being resistant to God, he still evangelized God. A lot of times we go, well, my life's hard. I don't have the job I want. I don't have the marriage I want. I don't have the kids I want. I don't have the money I want. I haven't been able to vacation the way I want. And so we just stop everything. Jonah actually answered the question. The only question he didn't ask, tell us about yourself and tell us about God. And guess what? These sailors, they were open to God because they were in the middle of their own storm. People are most open when the storms come, and there has been no storm like this pandemic. How interested are you and I in people like the sailors who are desperate to know but not yet been told? Do we evangelize God even in the midst of the storm? In Jonah 1 verse 10, he had told them he was running away from the Lord. So he had already told them that, but they didn't understand that the Lord that he was running from was the one who controlled the land and the sea. The sailors now know Jonah's God was the God of the storm. And they asked, what should we do to stop this storm? Do people ask us how to stop storms? Because if we have a relationship with God, there should be people coming to us saying, my marriage has experienced a massive storm. And we should be able to say, well, I know a God who helps with that. Now, you don't say it exactly like that, but you should have that light. Jonah, even when he was being resistant, even when he wasn't doing great spiritually, it was so obvious his God was the God who created and could stop storms, and these sailors wanted to know about that. In Jonah chapter 1 and verse 12, Jonah admits the storm is his fault. Jonah says, yeah, I know who and I know why. This storm is my fault. Jonah tells them, throw me into the sea, throw me into the storm, and then it'll stop. And guess what? Despite their complete lack of knowledge of God and to some degree a godlessness, these sailors were like, hey, we're not going to kill anybody. They had a conscience. They were open to God and they had a conscience. Too often we look at people and we go, that person would never believe. That person has no conscience. They had a conscience. They're like, we're not throwing you in there. And so guess what? They started rowing harder. All they knew was self-reliance. They didn't pray in the storm. They started out that way. They started rowing harder. If you found yourself doing that, like when the storm comes, you work harder. I do that. I raise my hand. I'm guilty of that. But the storm was too violent for self-reliance. You know, there are some storms that are just so incredibly powerful in our lives, emotionally, mentally, physically, spiritually. They're so traumatic. They're so difficult that even when we try harder, it doesn't work. And you know what? Once they saw they weren't making any progress, they turned from their powerless gods to the God of Jonah. When people are praying to powerless gods, we shouldn't critique them or condemn them. We should live lives that shine brightly, sending a message that the God we have is the God of the storm and the God who can still the storm. And when we're praying really firmly and really hard in our lives, we're experiencing the still and the end of storms, and we can help the sailors in our lives, the people who do not know God, find their way through the storm. Next episode is going to be praying to the God of Jonah, and that'll be coming up soon.